If you were around in the 1970s, then chances are your dad drove either a Ford Cortina or one of these, an original Vauxhall Cavalier. And not only are these cars celebrating their 50th birthday in 2025, but the Cavalier is also a rarity. Not only did the people take it to their hearts, but its success is also responsible for the mass market revival of the Vauxhall brand, still dictating how we perceive the Griffin some half a century on. Before we get into it, this car is to be auctioned by Manor Park Classics, so if you fancy floating about in a car like this, then please do follow the link in the description. But while following this car, Vauxhall again became a juggernaut of the British motor industry, things weren't always so rosy. So before sniffing around, we're going to need a bit of a history lesson. Under the watchful eye of General Motors since 1925, Britain's homegrown Vauxhall had rather failed in its quest for dominance. As a former luxury car brand, the Griffin's status was gradually eroded as the likes of Ford began to complement Austin, Hillman, Morris and more as the nation's favourite builders of people's cars. By the early 1960s, Vauxhall was scrambling to merely match the efforts of the Blue Oval, launching their new small family car, the Viva, in 1963. As a stylistically conservative attempt at overtaking the Ford Anglia, Vauxhall's reputation scuppered the Viva's progress, where it barely even registered next to the top-selling Austin Morris 1100. This reputation I speak of was one of decidedly poor quality. Vauxhalls were thought to rust like nothing else, and no matter their best efforts, reputations self-perpetuate, taking an age to drain away. Fast forward to the early 1970s and things weren't getting all that much better. Sure, the latest Viva was more than keeping its head above water, but the rest of the Vauxhall range was falling flat on its face in the market. The executive-facing Vauxhall Cresta had been killed off by 1972, while the new FE Victor wasn't only ugly, but it was also too large, leaving a chasm within the Vauxhall range and the market free for the now all-conquering Ford Cortina. But in spite of this plight, Vauxhall were gradually learning how to style and market a car in a way that, like Ford, meant it didn't overly matter what was beneath. As long as it was generally rugged and affordable to own, the British public would lap it up. The trick was making prospective buyers feel good about themselves. This is what the Ford Capri did. It was also what the original Ford Escort did, and it's certainly what the first three Ford Cortinas did. It's cars like these, and the Mark III Cortina especially, that Vauxhall saw as the archetype for what British consumers wanted in a family car. And over the coming years, their existing range of cars were gradually facelifted and augmented by niche versions that aimed to tap into the image that Ford was enjoying. Launched in 1970, the rather pedestrian HC Viva was more than comparable to the Ford Escort or run-out versions of the Austin Morris 1100. But in order to gain the image of the former, Vauxhall brought us the upmarket Magnum and coupe-bodied Firenze. Taken as a whole, the HC range became Vauxhall's best-selling model up to that point, and while they certainly weren't out of the woods, this turnaround in image may well have been what saved Vauxhall. It sounds a mad suggestion in the context of what came later, but such was Vauxhall's collapse overseas and their lack of love from the British public that GM could well have pulled the plug entirely. Instead, we found ourselves in something of a halfway house, it being here that we're introduced to West Germany's Opel. Adam Opel's company was bought by General Motors all the way back in 1929. Yet in the 40 years since, the two had remained effectively independent. Indeed, the Vivas, Victors and Crestas we've discussed were all designed and engineered by Vauxhall in England. But with the Griffin's aforementioned weakness and Opel's lack of British success, General Motors took the sensible decision to begin merging the two, creating the relationship we all know today, but transforming Vauxhall into something of a husk, but nevertheless, a husk that paid dividends. The seeds were sown for the Opel Vauxhall merger years before, the original HA Viva, for example, sharing a heck of a lot with its German counterpart, the Opel Kadett. Indeed, 10 years later, the FE Victor shared its floor pan with the Opel Rekord, undoubtedly contributing to its size. However, the two had remained only at arm's length, Vauxhall retaining the freedom to do as they saw fit until the launch of the Kadett C in 1973. Known across the world as GM's T-Car, sold in Australia as the Holden Gemini and the United States as the Chevrolet Chevette, the car was launched in Britain 2 years later, badged as the Vauxhall Chevette. With only a different front end and the old Viva's power unit, the Chevette spread itself across the lower end of the market, Vauxhall maximising its potential with 4 body styles, not only battling the Escort, but also the yet-to-be-launched Ford Fiesta, as well of course as British Leyland's Mini, Allegro and Marina, plus a number of the former Hillmans now produced by Chrysler Europe. The Chevette was a jack of all trades, but by 1975 Britain's market leader was the larger Ford Cortina, and from 76 Ford themselves overtook British Leyland to become our most popular manufacturer. Still languishing in third place, Vauxhall needed their Cortina basher, and launched in November 75, the Cavalier is exactly what they ordered. Back at the dawn of the 70s, however, Vauxhall themselves began developing a prospective Cortina competitor, based on a cut-down FE Victor platform and known as the Vauxhall Serion. But the Serion is notable for its body style, as besides potentially getting a V8, the clearly Chevette and Cavalier inspiring mid-size family car was also planned to gain a hatchback, much like the Renault 16, Austin Maxi and the yet-to-emerge Volkswagen Passat. But in light of the Germans' newfound supremacy, the Serion was canned in favour of a Vauxhallified version of the second-generation Opel Ascona. This, however, was no bad thing, as like the Serion, its sights were set firmly on the now Europe-wide Taunus Cortina. Merging in 1973, the new pan-European mid-size saloon had a few years of hindsight with which to view the Mark III Cortina, to analyse it and to exploit its weaknesses. The problem, as you might have already noticed, is that this was only 2 years before the final launch of the car. Something that wasn't such a big issue for Opel, having been working hard beforehand, yet for Vauxhall amounted to an extraordinarily short development cycle. Such a reality was imposed upon them by their American overlords, realising that the Victor's drop in production had the possibility of wiping out their dealers' profits, harming their brand's reputation even more than it already had been. The new goal, therefore, was to have the car up and ready 2 years before its initially expected launch, something that caused a bit of a rethink. From the outset, the idea behind what became the Cavalier wasn't merely to have a set of badge-engineered cousins, but to instead have fair and distinct differences between the two. For example, the car was supposed to have a decently modified body, maybe even with that aforementioned hatchback, but what was certain was the use of proper Vauxhall engines. The V8 might have been off the cards, but the slant 4 engine used in the Chevette HS was most definitely on the cards, as was the little overhead valve Viva engine that powered the cooking Chevettes. But with this new only 7-month deadline, the Cavalier would be very much an Opel, complete with Opel styling, an Opel interior, Opel engines, and even Opel production. The Chevette was one step towards an Opel-Vauxhall alliance, but the Cavalier was full integration. We'll come back to what that meant in a little while, But as the Cavalier reared its head at the end of 1975, it was effectively replacing the posher, more powerful versions of the Viva, the Magnum and Forenza. But through its much greater distinction, the Cavalier was always viewed as Vauxhall's first real challenge to the Cortina. It may have been built in response to and designed in the image of the Ford, but the Cavalier wasn't a product of panic. Instead, these cars were pristinely formed to meet the needs and wants of the average Cortina driver, and in a moment of bliss for Vauxhall, Ford were in the process of mucking it all up. The Mark III Cortina, launched in 1970, may have been the car that accelerated Ford's progress, but it also gave the fleet market a fright. I mentioned earlier how dependability and ease of service were what consumers wanted. This reality undoubtedly sinking British Leyland, but the Coke bottle Cortina was not all it was cracked up to be. Compared to the old Mark II, its double wishbone front suspension tore through bushes, while its new Pinto engine had a habit of eating its overhead camshaft. By the time the Mark III Cortina gave way to the Mark IV, the market was beginning to redirect towards the smaller Escort and Chevette class. Yet the big profits were still in the larger class, and the Cortina had really started to lose its shine. Besides these reliability concerns, the new body atop the Mark IV failed to win the plaudits the Mark III had, and this switch was just in time for the Cavalier. That's where I think we should start, therefore, with the styling of the new mid-size Vauxhall, and it goes without saying that I think it's a heck of a lot prettier than the Mark IV Cortina. That's not to say I don't like the Cortina, but I think the Vauxhall is so much better resolved. The sharpness of the front end with the droop snoot, those big headlamps, and also the very subtle grille below it, giving it a friendly appearance, but also a streamlined one. I'm also a big fan of how neatly the chrome's been done, and road-style wheels never miss. But then feeding towards the rear, again, it's all very neat, very crisp with how the pillars come down, leading into that boot at the back. I really like the blacked out rear panel, and the upturned edges, again, give it an approachability, reminding me quite a lot of the original Toyota Celica. We do naturally have to relate it, however, to the Ascona on which it's based, and honestly, I think the Ascona's aged better. The droop snoot front end certainly marked it out as a Vauxhall, but the 80s-ness that the Ascona precedes is handsome in its own right. Regardless, the Cavalier looked so fresh back in 1975, and compared to the mundanity of the Cortina, the Morris Marina and the Chrysler Alpine, then the clumsiness of the Austin Maxi, there's only one car that I'd be proud to be seen in, and it's the one with the Griffin upon its nose. But I mentioned a moment ago how the style of this car ultimately came down to Opel, droop snoot and all. You see, the Chevette may have been launched in the same year, but as its development cycle was normal, its style was defined in good time. Therefore, the folks at Opel had seen this new droop snoot corporate Vauxhall face and decided to implement it into the coupe version of the Ascona, the new Opel Manta. Therefore, Vauxhall's job was half done for them, and through recontouring sections and removing the extra grills, hey presto, the Vauxhall Cavalier. It's funny then, with all this politics going on, that the Opel-based Cavalier wound up looking very similar indeed to the ill-fated Serion. Sure, it may have lacked a hatchback on the 2- and 4-door models, but 3-box saloons were still very much the standard. Instead, the experiment was left to Vauxhall's version of the Manta, the aptly named Cavalier Sports Hatch. Mechanically, however, everything here is down to Opel. After all, for the car's first couple of years on sale, Cavaliers would all be assembled in Belgium, being imported to the UK before local production began in Luton during the summer of '77. But as we established all the way back at the beginning, Ford's success was built on simple, understandable, rugged and economical engineering. To those ends, the Cavalier is a classic rear-drive saloon, with a huge engine bay for easy service, as well as competent yet acceptable suspension. And I'm afraid the comparisons can only continue, because the suspension system beneath the Cavalier is almost identical to that of the Cortina, meaning that at the front we have a set of coil-sprung double wishbones, and at the back we have a simple good old live axle with a panhard rod and of course some trailing arms for those coil springs to sit on. And my first impression from the Cavalier is that it just all feels very steady. It doesn't feel magnificent or like it dances along the road or anything, but it just feels as though it's so very considered. So this is quite a large car, bigger actually than I expected it to be when I first viewed it in person, yet the steering is still perfectly light, despite obviously not having any power steering, yet it doesn't feel overly light. It retains a sense of weight to it that is a little bit confidence inspiring. The steering wheel as well isn't that big either, it's relatively small, this little two-spoke thing. And I must admit that the ride quality is really quite good. It's also better damped than I expected it to be. I expected just a little bit of floatiness, a bit of hopping across the road, but quite frankly, that just isn't the case. You can feel every bump that's happening. You can feel that it hasn't got an independent rear suspension. But if I go over these speed bumps, a little bit too quickly for them even, the way this copes with those bumps is better than many modern cars, which really shouldn't be surprising considering how many old cars I do prefer the feeling of. Yet with that ability to damp things very well, there are certain bumps you get to where it just turns into crashy. I imagine that is also more of a damping issue, but the lack of rear end sophistication can't really help matters. What I do find though is that the ride handling compromise is very much shoved towards comfort, because this car does not have a very well defined turning. Doesn't have a great turning at all, to be honest. Instead, you turn the steering wheel and you see the bonnet start lolloping in front of you, and then once it's thought about it, it then starts to turn in. It's a very relaxed kind of car in terms of its driving dynamics, but I don't think there's anything wrong with that. What this car feels to me is safe. And that's all that matters in a car of this kind of era, a car of this size, just the ability for it not to do anything stupid. And the front end with those double wishbones is very well controlled. But fundamentally, what this car feels to me is like a car that isn't particularly suited to towns. It feels like a car that's been designed for long open roads, lolloping country roads even, but all major A roads. It doesn't feel as though it has the responses that I really require of it when pootling around town. And sometimes when you get to a slightly tighter section of road, the weight in the steering, which gives you that confidence, which inspires an awful lot of connection between you and the car on something more straight, suddenly starts to become a little bit annoying and you start arm twirling slightly. So as with any car, the Cavalier is a compromise. And what it's compromised for is those big open roads, and there's no problem with that. I, in fact, think that that's a very, very sensible decision. It makes a lot of sense for a car like this to be designed for big open roads. What I am quite a big fan of, however, is the driving position in here. So I've already realised that I could do with going back a little bit more and reclining myself a bit more, but that's, just stuff that I can adjust. That's what you get after jumping into a car for the first time and driving it for all of 5 minutes. But these seats have quite a lot of support at the sides, which is unusual for cars from the 1970s. So I can imagine that on a long journey, again, on those big, high-speed, open roads, this car won't get uncomfortable on a long journey. Plus, if I want to recline myself a little bit more, I then end up in a very sporting driving position. Sure, I'm not especially low in the car, but I've got that view of the contoured bonnet, which looks fantastic in front of me. And huge though it is, it just allows me to see the corners of the car. And again, that inspires confidence, as does the brilliant visibility. But the steering wheel angle, maybe it's a little bit low, but it's certainly nothing to write home about. There's nothing wrong with it. And the pedal position, again, is just about right. There's nothing too much wrong here. The position of the gear lever, however, is slightly unusual. It's got this big, long lever that comes out of the dashboard at you, but that means that it's very, very close to the steering wheel. And it's very easy, therefore, to, as you're doing a maneuver on the steering wheel, which, of course, the weight behind it, you need to put the force into the steering. It's very quick just to go and grab a gear, which again inspires confidence and makes it feel like it was designed with actual human beings in mind. In terms of the style in which it comes out of the floor, it reminds me a little bit of an Alfa Romeo, a 105 series Alfa, but the change quality doesn't. Sure, all the ratios are there and you're not going to get confused with them, all four of them, but there isn't exactly much positivity. It's not so much the length of the change, there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Instead, it's just the vagueness of it all. You find the gear and it's there, and that's enough. But again, it's a very relaxed feeling to it. And the angle of this gear lever and the way, therefore, that you change it, again, encourages you to be in this very reclined driving position. This, I do believe, would make a very, very good long-distance classic car. After all, that's what it was designed to do. Isn't it great when traffic is going too slow for the 50-year-old classic car? It goes to show that cars haven't come quite as far as you think they have. But when production first began, before production started in Britain, all the engines for the Cavalier were all versions of Opel's cam-in head engine. And as the name suggests, it means the camshaft is in the cylinder head. But it doesn't mean that it's an overhead camshaft engine. Instead, the camshaft sits beside the valves in the cylinder head, actuating a set of tappets, which then go onto some rocker arms and then actuate the valves. So it is, in effect, an overhead valve engine still. This particular Cavalier is a 1600, which means a very respectable 75 brake horsepower. It's not a fast car by any means, but it certainly gets up and going well enough. And first of all, I want to mention the gearing, because this car is geared very, very long, again, to make it suitable for those big open roads. I'm finding it quite easy in town to end up in the wrong gear at the wrong time, because you have to be in the correct gear, because the engine doesn't quite have the grunt to get it out. But it does mean that in fourth gear here, we, at just over 30 miles per hour, we are barely idling along. It's a very, very low revving engine, which suits, of course, being overhead valve. That's something that they like. They like to chug away overhead valve engines, produce torque. But what this engine has in common with the Ford Pinto engine is its massively over square dimensions. That is, the bore being wider than the stroke is long. And that means that, unlike many British engines of the 1970s, or many British cars of the 1970s, should I say, this engine isn't afraid of revving. Sure, it doesn't have a particularly high red line because of that overhead valve nature, but it means that it still revs very freely within its own capabilities. And again, you can kind of tell that it's an overhead valve engine, but that just means it has torque. It just means it has grunt, and it means you don't need to do that with it. It's a stupid test, really, for me to rev out the car, because that's not how it's designed to be. Instead, it's designed to sit at relatively low revs and to just go and make this power. What I must observe and get across to you lot at home, however, is that most of the powertrain noise from this car is actually fan noise. And while that is totally normal for a car from this era, it's not a criticism at all. I think that with an electric fan, this car would be exceptionally quiet, in terms of its powertrain at least. At idle, this engine just ticks along so very, very nicely. It's my first experience of a cam-in head engine, and I like it a lot. As I said, it's not a performance car, but it just performs very, very well. When production in Britain did begin, however, supply, of course, went up, and it allowed Vauxhall to add a smaller 1300cc engine, a version of the old Viva engine, so there is a bit of Vauxhall in here at least. But between that and the big 2-litre 100 horsepower cam-in head, everything in this car just feels very well sorted. Everything just feels very adequate, and that is very much what the Cavalier is about. You'd be forgiven for thinking, having sat through my ramblings thus far, that I have some kind of obsession with the Ford Cortina. But you'd be wrong. My obsession, of course, is with all the silly, fluid, floating, front drive Austins and Morrises. But it's crucial to understand in discussing the Cavalier just how important the Cortina was, not only to the mid-size family market or the entire motor industry, but to society as a whole. In our view of the world from 2025, our choices are endless, and that's reflected by today's top sellers. Last year, just under 2 million new cars were registered in Britain, but our favourite, the Ford Puma, was sold only 48,000 times. Compare this to 1975, and only 1.2 million cars were sold. Yet our friend the Ford Cortina found nearly 107,000 new homes in that year. Taken as a percentage, that's a 9% market share, while if we fast forward to today, the Puma can only command a 2% share. The stakes, therefore, were infinitely greater back in 1975, where if a car became popular, then it went stratospheric. Vauxhall, however, could only reach 6th place, the Viva selling nearly 55,000 units. But from 1977, Vauxhall would begin cementing both the Chevette and Cavalier as popular, well-regarded and well-judged yearly members of the top 10. In years to come, Vauxhall badged cars would sadly come to an end overseas, being phased out in favour of Opels, the opposite proving true in Great Britain. But with this rationalisation of both development and sales, Vauxhall were undoubtedly saved from oblivion, and though they lost their independence, the Griffin would grow muscles it could never have before conceived of. The Mark I Vauxhall Cavalier did not outsell the Ford Cortina. As creatures of habit, the British public have always loved their Fords, and for me, that speaks of the value of reputation. Ever since the Cortina launched back in 1962, the goodwill that built up around the Blue Oval, even with their little wobbles here and there, proved very difficult to crack. Yet with an extra step in producing a more modern car in the form of the Mark II Cavalier with a hatchback and front-wheel drive, Vauxhall had allowed themselves to not only compete with, but also occasionally exceed the controversial Ford Sierra. Yet without this original Cavalier, it is unlikely that Vauxhall would have been able to do that in its subsequent generation, because success in the motor industry is not built overnight. Instead, you have to do a number of things right, not only in building the right car, but doing so at the right time, taking advantage of other people's mistakes, and then continuing it, of course, over subsequent generations. And while Vauxhall's future is now opaque under Stellantis, the way we perceive them can still come back to this Vauxhall Cavalier some 50 years ago. And with that, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.